Welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itron, COO, and with me is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing Communications, and also Wayne Winegarden, who is Senior Director of Business and Economics at PRI. So Wayne, we're pleased to have you as we talk about President Trump's tariff proposal on Canada and Mexico in real time. You have an op-ed on the issue that you just published in Forbes and an issue brief on tariffs that will be coming out soon. So as we tape this on Monday afternoon, the president has just announced that his tariffs with Mexico and Canada will be paused for 1 month. So what tariffs did the president initially propose? How did the countries affected respond to the U.S. tariff plan? And why were his proposed tariffs paused for a month?
Yeah, he seems to be obsessed with tariffs, which is a really ominous economic sign. It's really troubling. I don't think we should forget about Colombia, right? That came and went like a flash in the pan. But he was going to do 25% tariffs on Colombia, but then they caved to his demands and took back the deportation flight that they had objected to. But in this most recent iteration, we're talking about 25% tariff on all Mexican products, broad-based 25% tariffs on many Canadian products, as well as a 10% tariff on Chinese products. And I think it's really important to recognize our number 1, 2, and 3 trading partners in order are Canada, Mexico, and then China. So you're really talking about putting on tariffs on a large portion of the imports that we as consumers, right, we as individuals use on a daily basis. In terms of responses, the Canada, Mexico, and China, they responded as nations always do, which is when somebody starts a trade war, which is what President Trump threatened to do. The countries that are kind of subject to them, they responded with their own tariffs. Canada talked about, I think, about $155 billion worth of products that they would put tariffs on. Mexico talked about it, but kept their plans close to the vest, as in China. But they're talking about ramping up a trade war. And the most important thing to recognize is that nobody wins a trade war. When you get a trade war, all you end up with is losers. In terms of, why would they pose tariffs are paused for a month? I mean, that's a really interesting question. He talks about the flow of fentanyl and other types of border issues. And ostensibly, we're going to have a month where we can kind of come to an agreement. But, that kind of vague kind of statement is kind of what's paused it. But, what's troubling is that that's still out there. So we'll see what happens in a month. And of course, the threat of more tariffs, either on these trading partners or others, is always hanging out there.
So, Wayne, even though the tariffs were paused, as you say, we could be back on the brink of tariffs 1 month from now. So this interregnum gives us a good chance to talk through the dynamics of tariffs and why they're not exactly the best economic strategy for the U.S. So let's start with maybe something that's one common bit of confusion or a real misperception over tariffs, which is how they're paid and how individuals and businesses are impacted. If you think back to President Trump's inaugural address just a few weeks ago, he talked about he wanted to create a quote, external revenue service for all the revenue that he says will be created from tariffs. So let's start to break it down for our listeners. So first, who would pay for tariffs when imposed and how would they be paid for?
Those are great questions. I guess if we start with the external revenue service, I mean, that's just a vacuous proposal. You have to remember the U.S. already levies tariffs. It's the Customs and Border Protection that physically collects the revenues. Not that we should increase tariffs, because we shouldn't. But if you're going to increase tariffs, the Customs is perfectly capable of continuing to do this job. We don't need to create a new agency or rebrand the Customs and call it the External Revenue Service. I mean, this is just devoid of any type of substance. It's just pure marketing. In terms of who pays the tariffs, right? And this goes with any type of tax. And And I think if people walk away from this, the one thing they should remember is that tariffs are taxed. There's no difference, right? So like any tax, what's the incidence of it? Well, it falls on both suppliers and consumers, right? On the demand side and the supply side. What does that mean? Well, if we have a 25% tariff on Mexican products, right? And let's say Mexico sells the product to Walmart, right? Well, Walmart will be the entity that physically sends the check, or more likely electronically sends the money to customs. So first of all, it's a U.S. company or a U.S. organization or a U.S. person that physically sends money to customs. So in terms of, what the burden of the tax is, who pays the tax, it's American. Now, the incidence, which can vary from that is going to be on American consumers, on American businesses, because once Walmart has paid the tax, well, now they have a choice, right? They can either raise the prices, in which case consumers are paying more, or if Walmart doesn't raise the price, in our example, well, then either they'll have to reduce profits, in which case, the owners of the firms are going to be worse off, which, by the way, includes most pension plans. Or if they don't reduce profits, they're going to reduce wages, in which case their employees are worse off. But in each one of these instances, no matter where all that burden is borne, it's mostly borne by America. Now, undoubtedly, perhaps some of the costs will flow back into the foreign exporter because they may lower their prices a little bit to try to offset. But empirically, what we see is that that's a much, much smaller part of where the incident ends up. And the vast majority of it is going to be on American consumers, American workers, and of course, the profits of our companies, which is going to hurt the stock market, all sorts of ancillary economic harm.
So Wayne, we all agree that tariffs are taxes, and a lot of taxes are bad economic policy. So what do you think is President Trump's argument for putting tariffs at front and center of U.S. economic policy, as he's gone way back when he was a businessman?
Yeah, well, it's an understanding about what generates our prosperity. Where he starts from is this notion that if we put on the tariffs, then what's going to happen is, as opposed to buying goods produced in this case, Mexico or Canada or China, that consumers will buy instead goods in the U.S. So production in the U.S. will then increase. With increased production, we'll get increased jobs, increased income growth, and this virtuous cycle will result, and it'll help the economy. But that's not actually how things work in practice, right? That might be a chalkboard way of evaluating tariffs, but in the world we all live, that's not what happened. And I think it's also important to recognize that the U.S., right, we're the richest economy in the world. We have the highest living standard in the world. And for those who don't believe that, remember, Mississippi, which is the poorest U.S. state, their GDP per capita, right, how much income they produce in the poorest state in the U.S. is higher than almost every other EU country. I'm sorry, every EU country except Germany, and it's actually close to Germany. So our poorest state is about as wealthy as most of the EU. And the reason is because we embrace free markets and free trade more than any other nation. So when President Trump keeps talking about all these things, how we're getting ripped off, it's the exact opposite. Because we embrace free markets, we are wealthier and we have a higher standard of living than most of the world. So if we're kind of going to what's the impact, what we're doing imposing these tariffs is that we're actually undermining kind of the efficiencies and the productivity and the manufacturing that occurs in this country. And yes, while manufacturing employment has been declining, manufacturing output in the U.S. is at all-time high. And that's because of the productivity that we're getting. Remember, just like we transitioned away from an agrarian society, where at the turn of the 20th century, 40% of workers were in agriculture, now it's 2%. We produce more food than ever, but it's because of productivity. We're having very similar dynamics with manufacturing, which is wonderful. What we need to do is create opportunities elsewhere, an issue that must be addressed, but it's a very different issue than what we've been talking about and what President Trump is trying to do with his tariffs. The tariffs in and of themselves are going to just diminish our manufacturing capacity, diminish what our advantages are, cost employment, reduce income growth, reduce economic growth. They're just an unabashed negative for the U.S. economy.
Join PRI on Tuesday, February 18 at the Sutter Club in Sacramento for our 7th Annual California Ideas in Action Conference. We'll be gathering near the People's House to share what's missing the most at the state capitol: free market ideas. This year's keynote speaker is Scott Rasmussen, one of America's top pollsters and political experts. He'll be talking about the 2024 election and the lessons for California. Plus, hear policymakers, experts, and real-life change-makers share their thoughts on California's major challenges. And you won't want to miss what will surely be a lively panel discussion on the war on suburbia. Registration is free and includes a free lunch. So go to pacificresearch.org/events today to register and secure your spot for PRI's California Ideas in Action Conference on February 18th in Sacramento. So Wayne, let's look at the impact on consumers. So Prime Minister Trudeau, in his speech on Sunday night, he had a warning for Americans about the real-world impacts they'll face if anything like the Trump tariff plan is implemented. So how would a large tariff like that 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada, how would that impact the pocketbooks of Americans if it was implemented? And how would it also impact the availability of the goods we consume?
Yeah, like we've been saying, it's going to have negative impact. And I think something that economists often underappreciate or don't talk about enough is that the cost impact, right? The incidence is going to go in lots of different places, but some of that's going to go into raising costs for consumers. But those higher costs are going to be much more than just simply the tariffs. So let's just assume all of the costs of the tariffs go onto consumers, just for kind of ease of discussion. So if we have a 25% tariff, then those costs of an imported good, at importer, when the importer brings them in, that's going to be 25% higher. But then you have wholesalers, right, or the distributors that need to get the product from the ports to the stores. And then you have the stores that have to sell them. Well, each place along the retail chain, they have to cover their costs, and they know their volumes are going down because prices are higher. So they're going to mark up the costs, right? The typical wholesale margin is about 20%. Typical margin for retail is about 50%. Vary greatly by industry, but those are the averages. If you take the averages, your 25% tariff is going to end up, if fully passed through to consumers, to be raising prices by 45%, right? Just kind of doing the math of kind of those percentage increases. And that it kind of accelerated kind of impacts from just kind of the basic kind of retail chain is going to actually compound the problems created by the tariffs. And it's going to mean that the costs that consumers are bearing are going to be that much higher. And remember, what's going to end up happening is families across the country will be spending more money but buying less stuff. So we're going to be worse off because we're going to not be able to afford all of the same things that we used to be able to afford. We may not be able to go on a nice vacation this summer because all of our, extra income is now used to buying necessities. So this is all a recipe for kind of a declining prosperity. It's going to be lower real incomes. And also, by the way, all of the less volume that's going through means there's going to be fewer job opportunities, probably more layoffs, greater unemployment rates. And from a federal government perspective, it means that our payments on the income support program are going to go up. So there's all sorts of kind of secondary, tertiary impacts that just keep compounding and just make the trade-off or the impacts of this policy worse and worse.
So President Trump has also posted that Canada doesn't have anything that the U.S. wants anyway. What's all the big hullabaloo? What's the big deal about? But you've looked more closely at this. How important are the things that we purchase from Canada and also Mexico? How important are they to the continued strength of the U.S. economy and U.S. businesses?
Well, this is just Econ 1 type stuff. It really is. And it's a real tragedy that the president just doesn't get it, right? Because international trade allows companies to focus on those things that they do best. This is what economists call a comparative advantage, right? And it's by focusing on comparative advantages that now enables free trade to help us produce more and better things for less cost. It's the essential ingredient that's been driving our prosperity, and that's what we need forward. But in his statement that there's nothing that we want from Canada and Mexico. I mean, that's just demonstrably false, right? I mean, take beer, right? Something that we make, Canada makes, and Mexico makes, right? And there's lots of Americans who love to drink Budweiser or love to drink Miller Lite. And there's also many people who enjoy a Corona or a Molson or a Dos Equis, right? And so for those people who prefer Dos Equis, right? The U.S. beer is not their preferred product. That there is something that's made, in this case, Mexico, that is what they want. They're demonstrating that's what they want, because when they have the choice between these products, they choose the import, and that's actually again an essential benefit. And we have to remember, it's not about America, it's not about Canada. It's about an American and a Canadian, and what do we as individuals, what do we want? What makes us better off? And it's always that individual who can best decide which products they want to consume. And so the job of the U.S. government is to maximize that opportunity, not limit it based on the kind of the beliefs of the politicians. And I think the other thing we need to also emphasize is that because we have this North American integration, right, and the cooperation between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S., that we're all able to be economically stronger together, right? We're able to make better cars and have more plentiful energy supplies. And we also have access to more and fresher fruits and vegetables, right? Canada and Mexico, they get access to our computer technologies and financial services. I mean, all of this type of exchange makes citizens in all three countries better off. And what we really want to be doing is enhancing that, not restricting it.
Wayne, energy is something that you study a great deal. And, obviously it's an issue at play here with these trade issues. So tell our listeners how much we actually do rely upon Canada for energy supplies, and how would the kind of tariffs like Trump has been talking about, how would that impact how much we're paying at the pump and how much we're paying for electricity?
Well, I think, and we've talked about this a great deal, Tim, and California is the great example, right? When you start trying to force energy sources to what's the government desired energy source, and you restrict where we can get energy from, we end up with a more vulnerable energy system, with when I mean more vulnerable, I mean less reliable, and you also have a more costly energy system. And it's the middle class and the working population that bears the biggest cost when you have those types of policies. Well, taking away Canadian energy supplies is just a version of doing that, which is ironic when you think about how the Trump administration, rightly so, is pushing back against the mandates for specific technologies, offshore wind. They just don't make economic sense. Well, this is kind of a version of that to the extent that Canadian, oil is the right source, we want to be able to access it. We don't want to create artificial restrictions that make it more difficult for us to access, again, kind of an all of the above energy strategy. And Canadian oil should be part of that. In terms of how much that's grown, I mean, if you compare it to 30 years ago, we import on a monthly basis almost 4 times what we were doing back in the early to mid 90s. So again, we're getting more crude oil, other energy supplies from Canada. That's a fantastic development. It helps keep our supplies more robust. It helps maintain kind of, we can keep our energy grid running. We can keep our cars running, all of these other benefits. It keeps costs lower. We should be enhancing that, not trying to restrict it.
Now let's look at manufacturers. The U.S. has already been struggling to keep manufacturers and manufacturing jobs within our borders. How are these tariffs pushed by President Trump impact manufacturers and other businesses in the U.S.?
Well, on that, it's gonna hurt them. We actually have an example of what would happen, right? Because in 2018, during President Trump's first term, he imposed 25% tariffs on steel imports, right? It was so important to he wanted to protect domestic manufacturing, and that we were getting ripped off by foreign steel. And so he slapped on these 25% tariffs. And then what they're supposed to do is create a manufacturing renaissance in the U.S., right? So very similar justifications for what he's saying now. So if we look at the results, what did you see? Well, did in fact protect steel manufacturing jobs, right? If you increase the cost of a competitor, right, you're going to kind of help out that U.S. firm. Undoubtedly, that's what happened. And studies say he created about 1,000 steel manufacturing jobs. And if that's the only thing you were looking at, it sounds like it was a success. The problem is that the full economic impact requires a broader view. And so, one, domestic steel prices rose, right? And that's something that, it's interesting. It's a bit of a cronyism, which is actually everything that's wrong with kind of where our economy has been going, is that cronyism, right, has been increasing. And this is very cronyist in terms of these tariffs. And what you did is you saw not just foreign steel prices went up, but domestically manufactured steel prices went up. Well, steel is an input to lots of other industries, right? So now all of a sudden costs for building multifamily housing, costs for building automobiles and containers and all these other firms that use steel, well, their costs went up. And when their costs went up, right, that was inflationary. And while it wasn't the size of the inflation post-COVID, when you look at where that inflation would happen, domestic manufacturing, you can see a bump up, a one-time hit in costs, which is exactly what you would expect. So we had the higher prices from the tariffs, which is what we've been saying would happen. And that did, in fact, happen with the steel tariffs. What we also saw is all those ancillary costs, which we've been talking about, those did, in fact, come into play. Manufacturing jobs in other sectors declined because the costs were higher, and they lost 75,000 jobs. So we created or saved 1,000 steel manufacturing jobs, but in total lost 75,000 jobs throughout the economy. That is a really, really bad deal. That's really bad for the economy. And I think that is a demonstration, and a much smaller demonstration, of what would happen if he imposed tariffs of 25% on a much broader basis. We're going to see that type of impact on a much larger scale. And that's actually kind of scary to think about.
Just released from Encounter Books, read the new book from PRI's Sally Pipes, The World's Medicine Chest, available now at your favorite online bookstore. The World's Medicine Chest explores how America became the world's leader in biopharmaceutical innovation through market capitalism. But as Sally Pipes writes, America is the last best hope for millions around the world who are battling rare diseases and chronic conditions. As you'll read in The World's Medicine Chest, we can do more to fight and cure disease, but only if we continue to embrace private sector innovation over government regulation. Buy The World's Medicine Chest today at Amazon.com or your favorite online bookseller. So one of the special cases to highlight in certainly U.S., Canada, and Mexico and trade is car manufacturing. Now, it's been projected that if something like what Trump has proposed were to come into effect, car making in North America may come to a halt. So walk our listeners through how cars, and it doesn't matter, it's both foreign models and domestic models, walk us through how cars are manufactured in North America today and how there might be huge cost increases involved if something like the Trump plan were to be implemented.
Yeah, well, we've been encouraging companies to nearshore, right? We've been trying to get companies to move their manufacturing from China to Mexico, for instance. And that's actually worked. And what we really have is a North American kind of manufacturing kind of sector, you would say, for cars, where a lot of the value add happens in the U.S., and that's very good. But we have some value add happening in Mexico, some happening in Canada. Sometimes components will flow from Mexico to the U.S., to Canada, back to the U.S. So they're crossing the border multiple times, right? And each time a component crosses the border, it's an import into the U.S., right? If it goes from U.S. to Canada, it becomes an export, and then you import it back. Well, if we have a 25% tariff, each time one of those components crosses a border, the costs go up by 25%. If Mexico and Canada respond and tariffs on their end, then that gets compounded even further. Well, if you start compounding 25% by 25% by 25%, you're going to end up with a really huge increase in costs. And so what you're going to really start doing is discouraging production of automobiles, certainly discouraging the consumption of domestic automobiles. And as we've been saying, those higher costs are going to have really, adverse economic consequences for families, for consumers, for businesses throughout the country.
So President Trump has often talked about the U.S. getting ripped off by Canada and Mexico when it comes to trade. So you've been looking at this issue more in depth for an upcoming brief that you're writing for PRI. What are the current trade balances between our countries? And is a trade deficit really a bad thing? Walk us through how we should be looking at the trade relationships between our trading partners.
Well, I guess let's start with a theoretical question, bro, because that's a really, really good question. And so what's the trade deficit between California and Nebraska, right? And the bottom line is nobody knows because we don't track it. And we don't track it because it doesn't matter, right? Perhaps Californians spend more on corn from Nebraska than Nebraska spend on computer technology services. Perhaps it's the other way around. Doesn't matter, right? Because trade between California and Nebraska is making residents of both states better off. And we know this is a good happening, and that's fantastic, right? Well, this basic logic doesn't change simply because there's an imaginary line between the U.S. and Canada, or the U.S. and Mexico. So if the U.S. runs a trade deficit with Mexico, right, then that's fine. That means that people in the U.S. want to consume more Mexican products than Mexicans want to consume U.S. products. But what that also means, and this is the part that people consistently miss, is that if that's the case, that also means that Mexicans want to invest their savings in the U.S. economy to a greater extent than the other way around, right? These are just accounting definitions. It is true by definition because economics, just like accounting, is a double entry system. If we have a trade deficit, it means we also have a capital surplus. If we focused on capital accounts, that would sound great, a capital surplus. But we focus on trade, so it's the trade deficit. But what's happening then is we're buying more goods from Mexico. Mexico is investing more money into the U.S., which means that they're buying U.S. Treasury bonds, keeps our interest rates lower, means they're giving us more capital to invest in artificial intelligence and other types of kind of cutting-edge innovations, and we're all doing better, right? This is the win-win relationship that we should be encouraging, and whether we have a trade deficit or capital surplus or capital deficit and a trade surplus really isn't of any importance. And I will close this by saying, remember, Germany runs a trade surplus and their economy is barely growing. And again, they barely have an economy per capita that's much bigger than Mississippi, right? China, right? They run a trade surplus. Their economy is in trouble because they have huge financial imbalances, and the economy is really kind of beginning to crash into a ditch. So having a trade surplus is not necessarily a sign that your economy is healthy. In both the case of Germany and China, they have trade surpluses, and their economies have real structural issues that are much more problematic than any issues we have here in the U.S. So these are all just accounting definitions and are not indicative of what is kind of a strong economy, which is what we care about. And from that perspective, the U.S. is doing relatively very, very well.
So, Wayne, we've seen many administration officials today try to make the case that this isn't a trade war, it's a fentanyl war. And they argue that the tariffs plan, if they were to be imposed, it's really about putting pressure on China and Canada and Mexico over their roles in the fentanyl crisis in the United States. So it sort of begs the question, should we really be using tariffs as a means to achieve foreign policy goals or other goals that seem to be unrelated to a legitimate trade dispute? What are your thoughts on this? Is this really the best way to force the action we want to see from other countries?
No, it's a terrible way. We do have a fentanyl crisis. The best way to deal with any policy is to deal with it directly. And so, certainly outside my expertise, but if we need to interdict and deal with the drug issues, that needs to be done directly. If we need to cooperate with those countries, and it needs to be done in a cooperative fashion. These types of trade threats are just, they're very ineffective at achieving that goal. And there are much better ways of doing it through direct diplomacy, through working with people cooperatively. Trade threats are just the inappropriate tool.
So, Wayne, regardless of what happens over the next 30 days, use your crystal ball for us. What impact do you think that Trump actions will have on future relations with our next door neighbors? And do you think we're out of the woods with huge tariff threats for Mexico and Canada? And do you think that the tariffs are a strategy that we can expect in the future, especially in relations and disputes with the European Union?
Yeah, unfortunately, it seems that if Trump is going to interpret all of this as success, which it's unfortunate because it's not. So these threats are going to be out there. And I guess I would answer, Ro, your question by saying, if you were the CEO of an energy company in Canada and you're looking at investment choices, and one would kind of invest in getting oil to Japan, and the other is going to invest in a project that's going to send oil to the U.S., all of this tumult is going to encourage you to invest your ties with Japan. And the same thing is with the EU, even though we haven't threatened them with tariffs, these types of threats, they're watching, they know. And so it just encourages them to build economic relations elsewhere. And that's going to be, in the long run, that's detrimental to our prosperity. And it's also detrimental to a lot of our geopolitical goals to be disengaging in that way. And so it takes us down a very dangerous path. And so this is all disconcerting. And hopefully we can kind of get on a more stable path and a more cooperative path.
So Wayne, as we close, given all the issues that we've talked about today regarding U.S. manufacturing and economic growth and fentanyl, what should be the policies going forward to achieve what President Trump is talking about? You lay out some proposed strategies in your upcoming issue brief. Share a few of those with our listeners.
Sure. I think those basic strategies is just the fundamental pro-growth agenda, right? So if we look at kind of the major policy areas, we need a predictable rules-based monetary policy that gives the Federal Reserve price stability as its one and only goal. We need regulatory policy that minimizes the compliance burden and is only as intrusive as necessary. Fiscal policy should adhere to an affordable growth, maximizing size of government, which in past studies we've said is about 15% of national income. Taxes should be a low flat rate tax, just sufficient to fund those expenditure levels. And policy should promote global free trade between the U.S. and the rest of the world. These 4 planks are kind of the fundamental supply side policy prescription. And time again, they've shown themselves to be the most efficient way to promote kind of broad-based prosperity. That's really what President Trump should be pushing. That should be his kind of mantra for what he's trying to achieve. And if he did that, we would see kind of those huge growth benefits that we saw in the 1980s, that we saw in the 1990s, that really would improve the standard of living for all Americans. And, hopefully we'll be able to kind of get through this tumult and get to that type of kind of just real principled policymaking.
Thanks so much, Wayne. And we'll definitely continue to follow the tariff issue.
Well, thanks so much.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.